Hello and welcome to the Strength and Flexibility Summit presented by Nirvana Strength. I'm Ian McLeod, co-founder and head coach. We'll be speaking with some of the highest level coaches and practitioners in the world to get a better understanding of functional strength and active flexibility. You'll be taking away a wealth of knowledge of some of the most effective and safest ways to improve yourself and take your performance to the next level. On this session, we'll be speaking with Dylan Werner, and as per request, we're keeping the intro very short. He is the most average yoga practitioner that you'll ever find. But if you actually go onto his Instagram at Dylan Werner, you'll find out that he's anything but average. He does some amazing position and postures and holds and moves, and he's a very dynamic, yogi that has a very diverse background when it comes to his experiences in rock climbing and actually his training modalities that he's included from a lot of different arenas. So it'd be great to expand on this. Dylan, how you doing?
I'm doing really good. Thanks for having me.
No problem, man. And so with regards to the questions for today, I think a lot of them will be somewhat obviously focused on strength and flexibility, but there's definitely some questions that are more like integration questions with regards to yoga and postures as well. So, kind of getting into like the idea of like the physical practice of yoga, because that's kind of like more, I guess, what we're kind of focused on. Can you talk about just the general physical practice and maybe some of the more popular modalities, and then what are some of the kind of requirements you feel like are there for yoga?
I don't really think there are any requirements for yoga because the umbrella of what yoga is so large. And when we're talking about yoga, especially in kind of this arena or this sector, we're really talking about hatha yoga, or the physical yoga, the movement, which is when people say yoga, that's what they associate with. Once you're kind of more into the yoga scene, or if you're yoga, you start to expand yoga out to include more about breath work, meditation, and philosophy, and these different things that just lead to a better way of living. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, when we really talk about the physical aspects of yoga, it essentially, all yoga is a type of calisthenics. It's body weight movement. And in that sense, it's actually more of a limited form of body weight movement, since most of it is done just on one plane, or sometimes you might use a wall for two planes, but there's not much pulling stuff that you could add into it. So in that sense, the physical aspect of it is somewhat limited because most of what you're going to get is going to be pushing strength out of it. We like to talk about what traditional yoga poses are and non-traditional yoga poses. And I think what needs to be clarified with the history of the movement part of yoga, or the hatha part of yoga, is it's a relatively new practice, really going only back to like around the turn of the century of 1900s, when the English came into India and they started introducing these ideas of bodybuilding and calisthenics. And the yogis came up or answered with their own workout, which was hatha yoga. But before that, it wasn't really practiced too widely. And then you have people like Krishnamacharya, Pattabhi Jois, Iyengar, that really started to advance for the movement part, which tended to be positions that are very similar to gymnastics. And at that time, it was similar to Swedish gymnastics. And so you had deep flexibility, almost borderline contortion stuff, and doing all these other postures. But the general idea of yoga is to be a holistic practice, something that combines the breath, the mind, and the body all together. And so that we are essentially healing ourselves and building ourselves up in a holistic manner, rather than just focusing solely on the body or solely on the breath if you're only doing pranayama, or solely on meditation.
So when you think about like how yoga has kind of progressed, not just from the traditional aspects of it, but you see a lot in the West where tends to be a higher focus on the physical practice. How do you see that physical practice in more modern like training modalities and modern techniques starting to integrate into the practice in itself? How do you find that balance kind of moving forward?
I think the practice itself, it really lends to people moving in directions that most people don't. Unless you're a gymnast or a dancer, you're probably not going to be doing back bends or something like that. But now I think with the popularity of yoga, it's been bleeding into all different sports and stuff, because there's really a fantastic, I guess, like mobility part of it. There's also a lot of strength. All the strength work I do is pretty much yoga. I mean, it's calisthenics if you really break it down. The postures, I think, like anything else, like any discipline, really. I mean, maybe weightlifting is a little bit more strict, but any kind of movement-based practice is going to evolve. And that's what's really been happening with yoga. So when yoga came about, when it was popularized in the West it really started to move its way towards the West around the 70s. At the Yogashala in Mysore was established, I believe, in 1933 or 35. Don't quote me on that, but somewhere around that time. So this is really where that super strong physical, like Ashtanga practice started to come from. But so like when I think like traditional yoga poses, you could only really think back about 90 years or so to think like, oh, what poses are traditional. So there's nothing really so traditional. But since then, there's been a lot of evolving in the postures, and something that as a practitioner, I've tried to push, and I've really tried to incorporate pulling things from gymnastics and calisthenics and adding these things into what I would think of my yoga class. And now really in my practice and in my teachings, I've gone really away from trying to create postures or shapes. And yoga it's easy to get pigeonholed with yoga to think that we're trying to make warrior two and triangle pose and all these different shapes. And that's kind of the goal of the practice, or get the legs behind the head. The way that I use all these postures is really more like tools. So like, why am I doing a warrior pose, or why am I doing a triangle pose? And what can I get out of it? So I start thinking, well, if I'm lengthening the side body, or I'm strengthening the quads or whatever, and this starts to play into my intention. And once I have my intention, I could form the different postures to move me in that sense. And it's something that seems very common sense, or at least I think it's really common sense. And if you're a bodybuilder, you're going to go to the gym and you're going to do chest and tris, and you're going to pick out the exercises that do chest and tris. Unfortunately, with yoga, a lot of times that lacks, and we're just doing random postures. Not everybody, of course. There's as many different types of yoga as there is people teaching yoga. So,
to go along with what you're saying, even still with like bodybuilding and weight training, though there's like a specific exercise for, like, let's say bicep curls, you talked a little bit about intention, right? Is like, there's a massive difference between just doing the movement and then actually being very intentional with what you're trying to get out of the movement. So coming into, like, let's say the yoga practice, I'm sure you've had people come up to you and say, like, I do yoga every day, but my hamstrings are still so tight, or something is still so tight, like, and the improvements are, really slow. Like, when someone says that they're doing yoga every day, because typically I think a lot of people think of, yoga equals flexibility. And if I do yoga, I should get really flexible. But where do you think, or what are some of the common like mistakes that people are making when they're making that jump or that association? Like, is there something about the everyday practice that could be done better?
Again, this really depends on the type of practice you're doing. I mean, if you're doing an Ashtanga primary series, you're mostly doing a forward fold practice, and you're not really getting a lot of back bends in. I think you're right. And a lot of people do equate yoga with being flexible, or you need to be flexible to come into it. Or if you do yoga, you're going to get flexible. There's so many different aspects of flexibility. This is a huge, huge topic, which, I mean, you guys have been talking about it through, I don't know how many different coaches. Yoga, at least in the more common sense of it, is more static, or more plasticity holds, most of the stuff that you're doing? Or have you talked anything about like viscoelasticity and flexibility? We're talking about these concepts, the different.
I know that, so like most of the conversations, obviously, like we can only get so deep. I'm sure some of the terms have come up. Your number, we've had 46 conversations so far, so I'm sure it's somewhere in there, but I'm sure you can speak about it on a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to get a little bit more deep into the science of flexibility and a little bit more, because when it's like generalized,
water.
What's that?
It's like one little toe in the water, like not the whole body.
Yeah. So yoga, I mean, I teach completely different, and that just becomes from my background as a mover and what I know about flexibility and the science of flexibility, which is, it's all the information is out there. It's not like it's anything that's secret or anything that I came up with. But yeah, so yoga, I think, kind of generally tends to be more of a static stretching, or if we're talking about properties of fascia, this is more working into plasticity where you're changing the length. And scientifically, this is shown to increase the greatest or increase range of motion the most is plasticity stretching. But that doesn't mean it's by far the best type of stretching or the only type of stretching you need. When we think about flexibility, or someone that's coming into it, we want to be more rounded. So this goes from dynamic stretching, which really is working into elasticity, which is a property of the fascia where the fascia stretches and returns back. And when I say fascia, the connective tissue, I know it's like a buzzword, but I'm usually referring to myofascia, the muscles and the fascia together, since 30% of the muscles is fascia, because fascia is a singular thing. It is ubiquitous throughout the body. Everything is connected to that. So, the dynamic stretching and stuff, which we see for warming up. And if you're going to do anything kind of athletic, this is the kind of stretching you need. You don't really want to start with plasticity stretching because it's going to reduce your neuromuscular response if you want to do anything that is dynamic. So it's kind of the antithesis of what you need to do as far as stretching. But when you think about wanting to get flexible, yoga isn't an answer to anything. Yoga is just one kind of form. And depending on your teacher, the knowledge of your teacher and what they give you, you're going to get that. And unfortunately, it is kind of limited in this kind of static stretching. But the other areas actually that yoga is pretty good with is I would say is slow viscoelasticity. So viscoelasticity, in a very complicated scientific way to say it, is the nonlinear deformation that is both time and force dependent. So this is how a substance acts, like a polymer or anything. When you put it under a great amount of force, when it's a lot of force really quick, it acts like a solid. When you pull it really slow, it acts like a liquid. And you see this if you have like an ubek, you mix cornstarch and water together. Well, this is because the majority of our body is water, that our fascia is made up of a good amount of water, which is called ground substance, which is all these things that attract water, hyaluronan, glycosaminoglycans, heparin, these different molecules that are attracting everything. It has these non-Newtonian fluid dynamics. That's why when you jump and you land, your knees don't blow out right away, because that impact, that force, turns them into a solid. Well, it turns out this is also the best way to strengthen into your joints and hydrate your joints, because your joints are made of, or lined with hyaline cartilage, which doesn't get a lot of circulation, at least blood circulation. So you need that kind of force and pressure. And unfortunately, yoga doesn't usually do those kinds of things, but movements that are really good for fast viscoelasticity, which we wouldn't consider something as stretching, but when you think about stretching is increasing your mobility and the strength in your joints, or one kind of definition of that, then burpees really fit into this idea of that. On the other side of that, so that's your fast side of viscoelasticity. Remember, this is a property that is throughout the entire body, is slow viscoelasticity. And this has to do with creep. When you pull something like a piece of like gum or silly putty or something, when you pull it really slowly, it stretches more and more. or taffy. If I take taffy and I pull it, it stretches. Well, if I start to warm that up, fold it in half, pull it, fold it in half, pull it, I get more flexible. This is something that yoga does well because there's a lot of repetitions. If you think of sun salutations, forward fold, back bend, forward fold, back bend, going back and forth between strengthening the superficial front line and lengthening it, and the opposing side of the superficial back line. So working into these properties, you start to develop something called creep, which allows the tissues to actually pull apart and expand a little bit more. And so I think yoga is really good in that. And that's going to help you a lot with your mobility before you go into deeper, longer stretches. So usually when I think about how I approach yoga for flexibility, I start with something that's a bit dynamic or elastic. So I'm working into these elasticity. Most other movement modalities would call this dynamic stretching. It's really the bouncing. Bouncing has got a bad name, especially after the 80s with ballistic stretching, because it could cause a lot of damage depending on how you do it. With the sciences, I wish I could, maybe I could give you some links to this or something. But what the science shows is we actually get the maximum range of motion as far as when we go through our remodeling phase at 80% of our stretch. And there's really no need to go beyond 80%. You can go there, you can go to 100%, people push it beyond. When you push beyond, you're gonna end up with injuries. But if you just approach to 80% of your length, you're gonna see the maximum growth results over time. We don't need to go all the way. And so when I do dynamic stretching, I'm usually within this 80-85% range, so that I'm just working into bouncing. So if I'm doing my arms or shoulders like this, I'm not trying to go for end range. I'm just working onto conditioning the fascia and elasticity. And then you can move. So the elasticity range is about 0.8 to 1.2 seconds. So really right around a second, we're targeting into that aspect of fascia. And then if we move into fast viscoelasticity, it's instantaneous movements like burpees, getting a lot of pressure onto the joints. Really important when you move into the slower kind of stuff, because if you have weak joints or joints that aren't healthy, they're not used to this dynamic thing, you start to end up with injuries. And this is one of the reasons why there are so many different injuries in yoga, because people kind of shy away, or a lot of people that come into yoga, they don't like this type of movement, so they tend to avoid it. But it's a movement you really need, putting fast pressure onto the joints. Yeah. The slow viscoelasticity, this is the creep. So when we're starting to warm up the muscles, this is done through oscillating movements, going through agonist and antagonist, so forward and back through something. And this is kind of a slower pace, roughly around, these numbers aren't exact, but it's kind of a good ballpark, roughly around 5 seconds to 30 seconds. So we're moving back and forth, and this is going to help to mobilize all of our joints in those opposing areas. After you get into that, then you could start thinking about plasticity, which is the longer, slower holds, where we're really just holding for 30 seconds to about a minute. There are forms of yoga where people like to hold poses like yin for 5 minutes to 10 minutes or whatever like that. But the science hasn't shown that there's any increase of range of motion from holding poses longer than a minute. In fact, we should only be stretching one muscle group about 2 minutes a day to get maximum results. After that, you can stretch more, but you're kind of wasting time. But if you think, I only really need to stretch my hamstrings for about 2 minutes a day. But the thing, what we want to do is have consistency. So when I started looking at the science, it changed my practice. My practice used to be doing one day of okay, today's all hips, and I just spend all this time with hips. And then the next day is all forward folds or something like that. And we see that a lot in the sequencing of yoga classes, and you see that a lot in the sequencing of fitness classes, depending on how they are. But you want to spend a little bit of time in each group, and you want to do that 6 days a week. So consistency is key, and this does two things. You have what's called a degradation and synthesis phase. So this is when we're breaking something down. If you work out, you move into degradation, and degradation is when the muscles break down, or the fascia break down, or whatever tissue breaks down. And then after that, you move into synthesis, where it starts to build up over a certain time, it reaches its max synthesis, and then it comes away from that. So it comes up and then banks back down. And this is called your net synthesis. Well, with flexibility, unlike strength work, in strength work, you want to move really deep into degradation, and so that you're really tearing down those muscles, and then you give it a good long, maybe 4 or 5 days to recover for you to get back into that synthesis phase. With flexibility, however, if you break down, because you're talking more about fascia when we're talking about flexibility. We haven't even started talking about the neuromuscular part of flexibility, which is a whole nother subject that we could talk about. But when you start breaking down the fascia, it takes a lot longer to heal. Majority of our fascia is made out of collagen. Collagen has a half-life of 1 year. So that means we have like a turnover of fascia about every 2 years. After 6 months, 33%. So we don't really want to break this down. And we also have short-term and long-term recovery. So when we think about this, when we're moving into that breakdown phase, that degradation phase, that we don't go so deep into it. And this allows more stimulus for the synthesis phase. So we're kind of, instead of doing these big waves of breaking down, building up, breaking down and building up, which is more divided by time, we're more consistent. So we're spending 1 to 2 minutes every single day in each body part, which still takes quite a long time to do a full flexibility practice. I mean, you're hard pressed to get 30 minutes, the whole body 30-minute flexibility practice in. But once you do that, you'll start to see dramatic changes. When I changed just in my back bend practice, I was never like a really good back bender, but now my back bends are quite deep. I could easily put my feet on my head in a back bend. What I started to do was just 1.5 minutes of wheel pose every single day, and really focusing on opening up the shoulders and the hip flexors.
So going on to I think a couple ideas that it'd be good to kind of expand on. And this second one, this last one, we're kind of talking about doing a little bit every day. And it's something that I talk about with some of my members as well. It's like for example, like farmer strength, right? Like farmers are essentially, it's just part of their lifestyle. They're just doing a lot of repetitive movements. A lot of them are very similar. They're taking things to a certain range of movement that's required for their lifestyle. And this was something that and they're just crazy strong, right? They're not training any one thing super hard. But then also too, I talked with a couple of the other speakers about the idea of performers and their training routines, where maybe they'll have 1 day a week where they go super intense on their flexibility or somewhat, but their daily routine actually requires them to do a lot of what you're talking about. Is they're doing a little bit of everything kind of every single day. And they're probably most likely seeing a lot of their flexibility gains from their actual daily activities. So I mean, I would agree with you that, there's a lot more that needs to be included in your daily actions. You shouldn't get into a full ass to grass squat once a week, or you should actually have that capacity to sit down full deep into your squat every day, and that be part of all the other body parts. So one thing I want to kind of talk a little bit about is the idea between cold and warm flexibility, the idea that you should have access to a certain percentage of your range of movement even if you don't warm up. Can you talk a little bit about that idea?
I think there's this your cold flexibility. So when you think about your range of motion or cold flexibility, this is right when you start moving. I don't know about how much access you should have as far as range of motion with that. But on a fascial level, what's happening when you're not warmed up is the layers of fascia. So fascia, it connects everything together, but its other role is actually to separate everything apart. And between the layers of fascia, you have what's called the perifascial membrane. And so there's the neuro side of this as well, which allows you a certain range of motion. When you have stretch tolerance that says okay, this is how far you can go. Well, that right there is going to allow you to have like so much cold flexibility. It's going to move into it, but then you're going to get into a structural limitation of the fascia actually sticking together. And one of the ways you could think about it is like when you wake up in the morning, you feel really tight. If you try to go in a forward fold and touch your toes, it's pretty challenging, but then you start moving a little bit and you warm up, and then you could easily place your both hands on the ground. Well, what happened was you didn't get more flexible. What you actually did is you started to break up these layers of adhesions between the layers of fascia. That perifascial membrane is very similar to like an egg white. So if you take an egg white, when you first break it open, it's super slippery. It's like one of the most slippery things. But if you leave it for a little bit and it starts to dry out, then it gets really sticky and super tacky. And then you could put it in your hair and make a mohawk, and it becomes hard as a rock. Well, the perifascial membrane is really similar to that. So if we go with long periods of inactivity or without moving, if we're sitting a lot or you sleep or whatever, you're going to wake up and feel stiff because that perifascial membrane starts to get a little sticky. It starts to dry out. Remember, a big part of the fascia is being hydrated and attracting water to it. And one of the ways that we do that is through movement. So once you start moving, you get a lot more flexibility. And that's really just allowing the two surfaces to move across each other. If I take my shirt and stick it together like this and I try to pull on one side, well, when it's stuck to the other side, it's not going to move very well. But if I free that up, then I have all this movement. I don't know, is that kind of like where you're going on? Or
for sure, it kind of leads into like just the general idea of, you know, if you're just like walking around, do you have the capacity to like a certain movement? Like, can you go into a full squat? Or because I hear a lot of people say with regards to flexibility is like, oh yeah, I can do that if I spend 10 minutes warming up and then I can get into this position. But from our like daily actions, like incorporating our physical practice and how it translates to like daily normal routines, it would be nice to see that, that the flex, and this kind of goes into a greater idea of like, let's say something like hot yoga, where, some people will say like, I can only be flexible when I get into a hot yoga class, or they feel like they have to be incredibly warm to even, be able to perform some very basic movements.
When you're warmed up, you're definitely going to have a lot more range of motion, a lot more flexibility. To say that you should be at a certain level or whatever, it's probably a sign of the rest of your day is pretty sedentary. Like if you're not doing these movements regularly, then your body's not going to get into it. Then if you look at the neurological side of flexibility, the body looks at what is useful, like what does it need for flexibility. So it gives these feedback things. And if you're doing something all the time, if it is a daily movement, then it's going to be in your movement repertoire. But if it's something that you only do maybe once a week when you go to hot yoga, then it's probably not going to be readily accessible to you. To go a step further for that, for some people, it's going to be always readily accessible, and for others it's not. And this has a lot to do with your genetic makeup. That some people are more prone to flexibility, some people are more prone to strength. And no matter how hard you work, because of the way that your collagen is arranged, because the amount of maybe type 2 collagen that you have compared to elastin or compared to type 1, you're going to have a more difficult time getting into this. Movement organizes fascia. So what you're doing, you're going to restructure the way that your body is put together. And so if you're wanting to have these areas of active flexibility, cold flexibility, if you're wanting to be able to just go into the full splits at any time, you need to be doing that all the time. So that movement starts to create those patterns. And for some people, it might never happen. This is something that I think there's a misconception that everybody could be super flexible, everybody can be a contortionist, and that's really not true. Like there's a lot of bodies that just aren't built for that. I was having a conversation with this girl yesterday, and she's a very slender, not much build, not much muscle, and she's like, well, if I eat lots of meat every day, will I start to put on muscle? And for her, the answer is probably it doesn't matter how much she eats or whatever, she's probably not going to put on mass. She'll definitely put on muscle and get tone and shape up. But if you look at some people that do tons of working out, and it doesn't matter how much that they're doing, they're not going to get big shoulders like Ian and a super huge chest. They're going to stay relatively small and just get toned within that. And that's part of the genetics. People have a predisposition from when you're born, and also the movement history of your entire life coming up to that point. The same is true with flexibility. If you are a naturally tight person, you're probably always going to be a tight person. And you're also somebody that's going to really not have a lot of movement in that cold flexibility. You need all the advantages that you can get. It doesn't mean that you won't see improvement. You definitely will. One of the things you should know with the body is whatever you do, you're going to get better at doing it. But be realistic with what your goals are going to be, your outcome of your practice. Don't try to think that you need to be somewhere. Just when we talk about college and having a half-life of 1 year, and this is what's responsible for a lot of our range of motion, that plus the neurological response with stretch tolerance. It takes a long time to build that. It takes a really long time to get into deep flexibility, years and years for people. And sometimes the work that you do now, you really won't see the results for a year or 2 years from now when it comes to flexibility. Unlike strength work, the strength work that you do now, you'll see it right away. There are aspects, because remember, like flexibility is this huge umbrella of different things that are contributing to what gives us our flexibility. One of them being the fascia and the makeup of the fascia, one of them being your genetics, one of them being hydration, one of them being the stretch response or the neurological response. And all those different things have, and there's more, but we don't need to get all of them, but all those different things are going to contribute to that. So you can't just approach one and think that you're going to open up. If you approach one, you might see the results from that, but eventually it's going to lead you to the end, and you can't get any more without moving down these other pathways of flexibility.
Yeah, and I think something that if people listening in like have any questions with regards to like how does like this conversation of cold and warm flexibility, how does this conversation of doing a little bit of kind of everything every day, how does that kind of translate to like your daily practice? I think if we think about something like programming, right? If you're in, obviously your body's going to adapt and mimic what your actions are, what your lifestyle's like. So if you're only doing like a really hard session like once a week, it's probably not. But then the rest of the time you're spending sitting like 10 hours a day at a desk. I mean, what's more likely that your body's going to adapt to and find what is useful? So I think when you think about the idea of like being safe in your practice, like I think a lot of times people might only train like 2 or 3 times a week and then have wrist problems because they're pushing their wrist to like extremes when the rest of the time they're not really using their wrist much at all. And also too, when we think about just a better way to build strength as well. I think from a long-term perspective, when it comes to muscular endurance and things like that, it's nice to be able to have more volume, right? I mean, at some point, I think with regards to strength in yoga practice, where do you kind of find some of the limitations in making improvements in strength when it comes to yoga?
It's a little bit different because I'm not going for mass gains in yoga. I'm going more for that farmer strength gains. Like I want to be able to do lots of repetitions. So like I do more kind of advanced movements like handstand push-ups, scorpion push-ups, crow to handstand, these kinds of things. And so I'm not seeing like the massive gains I would if I approached it more in a bodybuilder, but I'm seeing a slower gain through it. So I mean, I love yoga, but it's by no means a perfect practice for movement. So it's like when you're doing anything, you really got to understand what your goals are and find the best tools or the best approach for that. And if it's really about making big strength gains, then yoga might not be for that, or depends on the kind of movement that you want to do. If whatever it is like you want to be good at, that's what you should do. So if you want to be good at lifting heavy weights, you should lift heavy weights. You shouldn't do yoga. But if you want to be good at body weight movement, then yoga is probably going to be more beneficial than just lifting heavy weights. And if you want to be more well-rounded, do all of it. You know, it's like there's no reason not to do one except for the amount of time that you have in your day. There was a question Angela asked here. I wanted to kind of just hit that and then Lewis. So balance between passive and active stretching. This is something I think a lot of people are confused on. What is active stretching? What is passive stretching, and what it does? And I'm sure maybe your other coaches talked about it, but I'll just cover it real quick. So active stretching is when a muscle is engaged and you stretch into that engaged muscle. So if you have like your hamstrings, when you start to bend the knee, you're engaging the hamstrings. If the leg is straight, then you're, let's say, in a seated forward fold. When you push your heel down into the ground, that engages the hamstring, and then you move into a fold. What that does on a physical level or a physiological level is when the muscles contract, they stretch the tendons. So the muscle gets shorter, the tendons get longer. And that contraction of the muscles is trying to hold its length. So when you're active stretching, meaning the muscle that you're stretching is active, and you move into that, now you're stretching more into the tendons, more into that part. Also a little bit into the myofascial muscle, but the majority of it is going to be in the tendons. When you do a passive stretch, then you're stretching more into the belly of the muscles because there's less tension on the tendons. The muscles is relaxed. So that same forward fold, but instead of pushing my heels down and engaging my hamstrings, I'm relaxing or maybe even engaging my quads. So I get that reciprocal inhibition. It doesn't mean that everything needs to be relaxed. It just means that the muscle that you're stretching needs to be relaxed. And in yoga, I don't know if it's in other forms of fitness, but in yoga, this is definitely something that is confusing because we think of yin, that everything has to be relaxed so that we can get into that joint capsule. I'm not a much of a yin advocate, but I am very much for passive stretching. And then the other part of that was like 80% of, so 80% is that active range of motion. So that's where you're thinking, is she's thinking mobility with that?
Well, I think when you were talking previously about, like when we talked about the idea of having a certain amount of access to, or moving for your warm up, right? You were talking about being able to get to about 80% as opposed to taking it to the end ranges.
It's 80% of your end range.
Yeah.
80% of your end range, not so much your active. So wherever your end range is, and your end range is where you just like, that's as far as I can go. And your body tells you, it's like, this is it. So it's really easy to find end range, and you just back off a little bit off of that. It doesn't have to be exact, but just know that you don't need to be in that end range, because that's actually where you're going to start to see some injuries. And when we think like, I need to be at the end, I need to push hard, and we get this mindset. But I mean, I was definitely like that for
regards to like active and passive ranges, you know, like if you're using your body and your muscles and just your own capacity to move yourself into a particular range of movement, it's really quite difficult to hurt yourself, because you're generally not going to move yourself into a position that is very dangerous. It's when generally a lot of people, I feel like they get hurt is when they start applying some external load, or they start using some external force to kind of push them into a range of movement that they might not necessarily be very comfortable in. I find that to be the most common cases of injuries. Dylan, I don't know if you have any other experiences with.
Yeah, I mean, we like go into the forward fold thing. You see it like if you're in a forward fold, you grab your feet and you start pulling with your arms, trying to get as deep as you can, and you find like, okay, this is it, and you still go farther. That's where you're going to get that pain. It's really hard to injure yourself with active mobility. So or mobility. When we talk about active stretching, we're talking about what the muscle is being active. When you're talking about mobility, or like your active range of motion is versus passive range of motion. So your active range of motion just with your own muscles, it's really what your mobility is. So how high can you lift your leg versus how far can you push into it with an external force. So really, it's really hard to.
But really, really quick, when you think about the forward fold. Can you talk just briefly? What are the external? So if you're doing a forward fold, you're trying to stretch or get a range of movement in a particular part of the body. In the example that you gave with regards to like taking the hands and pulling them in, like what are the external forces that are being applied to that could actually lead to injury?
Well, it also depends on how you're doing the forward folds, because now if you start talking about monoarticulate stretching versus polyarticulate stretching, so stretching through one joint versus many, I think in yoga we actually in most things we tend to focus a little bit more on monoarticulate, where you put most of the stress in at that joint. In a forward fold, it's going to be your hamstring attachments and your sacrotuberous ligament, because that's where most of the force is going. The sacrotuberous ligament is super strong, so you're probably not going to tear that, but your hamstring attachment, you will. If you do more of like a rounded back forward fold, different advantages. It's not better, it's just different. You'll probably run into the neuro resistance or the pain from your stretch receptor saying stop long before you get into your actual end range of motion, where you can't go any farther. Is it?
So that's something to think about for people. I always think that like an external force or external something external being applied to the particular stretch or to any particular movement doesn't necessarily have to be like an external tool, but it can actually be like the example you gave of just using in this forward fold positioning. Your arms are not really playing a primary role, right? They're the actual like assisting tool or the additional tool that's actually pulling you into a greater range of movement that you might not necessarily be able to get yourself into.
Right. Basically using anything other than the agonist muscles that you need. So if you're stretching, if you're moving, and if I'm coming into a forward fold, I'm using my quads, my hip flexors, my core, all those things to come into that position. So it's only the strength of my muscles that is fighting against the hamstrings and my erector spinae and whatever else that I'm stretching, gastrocnemius and all that. So once you add anything else into that other than those agonist muscles, it becomes an external force. And that's not saying that's wrong or bad, but that's where you move into the chance of injury. Like if you're lifting your leg, if you lift your leg straight out in front of you and you lift it up as high as you can, the chance of you lifting that leg so high that you injure your hamstring are almost none. But if you grab a hold of your foot with your hand and then you pull it up higher, the chances greatly increase. So that's kind of like what you're thinking about. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons why you want to explore both of those. The active mobility. This is something that I see a lot with flexibility and strength and all this, or just movers in general. Is we get into a practice, we get into a discipline, and we want to demonize the other disciplines because we think ours is the best. Well, yours might be the best, but it's probably just the best because that's where your goals are. If my goals are around mobility and active range of motion, then I'm probably going to focus on that. But what I don't want to do is demonize passive range of motion. We think like passive range of motion is bad, but depends on who you are. If you're a contortionist, if you're a circus performer, if you're an aerial artist, if you're an acrobat or any of these things like where you're moving into these deep shapes, an arm balancer, you really want to have the extreme passive flexibility because that's your sport and that's your art. So we got to be careful about thinking like what is good and what is bad, right? Like for me to put on as much muscle as Ian has would be really bad because it would limit the stuff that I'm able to do. And when I work with Ian and I try to make him do the stuff that I do, it's really hard because he has all this extra muscle mass, right? Like I'm a pretty avid rock climber, and to have that much muscle mass would be a detriment to the sport. But if I try to do the stuff that Ian wants to do and likes to do, I can't do it because I don't have the mass or the strength that he has. And one isn't right or wrong. It's just like we need to understand what our disciplines are and go to that instead of thinking like this is the best way, especially with flexibility. There's some people out there. I'm not going to name names.
Automatic approaches that can be taken. But kind of going into like the idea of like flexibility and maybe injury prevention, but also to like how do you, so Lewis is asking here, like, how do you incorporate or continue training, but keeping like some kind of injury in mind? So if your wrist hurts or if your hamstring hurts, like how can you maintain some level of safety in your training as you deal with those injuries?
Yeah, this has been, you hear different ideologies. I could say like, what, if you go to a doctor and you go to a doctor that's not a mover, the first thing that they're going to tell you is to immobilize it, to allow it to heal. But if you're a mover, you know what that lack of movement is going to do to your overall practice. I've had several injuries throughout the years, usually from different stuff. I just tore my hamstring, not my hamstring, my gastrocnemius, grade 2 tear, and a less than 50% ACL tear rock climbing. I was doing a heel hook and it tore, and I did take an initial break off of it and got an MRI and saw all this stuff. But as soon as I could get back into training, I got into training. I injured my shoulder. I'm still working with it. I'm still going through it. And I stress it to the level of where I feel, I do feel pain if I go into like a forward fold or a half splits or something, but I'm very aware of my injury and I'm very aware of not to push myself too far. And so understanding your types of pains or your sensations of pain is really important. And I think most of us know, if you're in tune with your body enough, like, if I do this, it's going to cause more injury, or this is just the injury talking to me, because you're going to need to move through that. When you stop moving, you're having immobilization for a while, you're going to have to break through all that all those adhesions and agglomerations and stuff. My left shoulder was kind of messed up, actually, from doing acro at Nirvana strength. I was just doing a lot of stuff with beginners. And the thing when you're doing like hand to hand and these kind of work with people that are new and maybe bigger than you, you're compensating a lot for them. And so the chance of injury is really great. I was having a lot of fun. I didn't want to stop. I knew I was sore, but it ended up becoming an injury that's lasted almost a year. And through that, like during lockdown, I wasn't really able to do chaturanga or anything. It was quite bad. I had a bit of an AC separation.
Mm.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of movements that I couldn't do. I was still able to do handstand and stuff, but I did every movement that I can do, and I did it the best that I can do. And so I built up that strength and trying to strengthen the muscles around it so I can work into it. And again, just being careful not to overdo it, but also to do it enough where it's going to grow. The body grows off of stress. And so if we are not stressing something, it's not going to grow. And this is kind of where sports science and stuff is going. Now my shoulder feels pretty good after lots, but I fixed it almost with the same things that I injured it with, in a sense.
But I think if, when people think about like dealing with injuries and movement and continued movement, and like one of the basic ideas of like rehabilitation and physical therapy is that you are, whatever your range of movement happens to be at that time dealing with that injury, is that you're wanting to continuously increase the range of movement in a very controlled manner and continuously like increase the level of intensity of the particular exercise or movement. And that could be anything from like you only lifting your leg, like if you hurt your leg, the weight of your leg could be enough of an intensity to force like some level of adaptation. But also too, like, remember what we talked about previously about the difference of like using some external forces to pull you into a position that might not necessarily be safe versus you just actively using your own muscles to actually pull your body into position. I think that would be kind of a general way to think about incorporating movement, but reducing the risk of further injury. So kind of getting into, we have just another 10 minutes or so. So when you think about more like advanced movements, so like yoga postures and like binding and maybe going into a lot of the spinal stuff, how do you find that like binds and postures, like high level postures and back flexibility, do you find that to be any different with regards to your approach to flexibility in a general way, or is there another way that you kind of think about those?
That's a good question. Well, I think there's only like two types of movements. There's movements that's good for you, and there's movements that are bad for you, and that's not ubiquitous. It's not the same for everybody, and so we're all going to have things that we're really good at. For me, like because I was a wrestler and a rock climber for so many years, internal rotation on my shoulders, doing binds like Gomukhasana, where you're binding behind your back like that. Those are awful movements for me. Overhead flexibility is good. So I don't feel like I need to do these things. And this is, I think, something that you should ask yourself when you're approaching a practice. Maybe you're an Ashtangi or a yogi and you're trying to get a certain pose. There's nothing that is in that pose that is worth the risk of injury. And so maybe working towards that is good, but I don't do a lot of binds. I do binds that feel good. I do binds that are easy. And it's more like, why am I doing this bind? I'm doing it to help my internal range of motion. I'm doing it to do this. There are certain things, because I'm also an arm balancer, hand balancer, like there's an aesthetic thing to it. So I do want to get into shapes that are beautiful, which require like a certain amount of range of motion. So I'll work into that. But there's always a risk versus like the health of your body versus the reward of it. And it's, you never want to injure yourself to try to do a certain bind or something like that. So if the movement feels good for you, then do it. And if it doesn't feel good for you, then don't push yourself to a place of injury. If it's most injuries, because most injuries are fascial injuries, even if you tear a muscle, like I said, 30% of the muscle is fascia. So most injuries are fascial injuries that we have. They take an incredibly long time to heal, usually 8 months to a year, sometimes longer, sometimes depending on your special Wolverine healing factor. You might heal up a little bit quicker. I wish I had Wolverine's powers, but yeah, so it's not worth moving yourself back in the practice to try to get something. So yeah, if the binds feel good, then do them, but there's nothing you're going to get specifically out of it. There's a lot of movements that we do in yoga that really like what's like Marichyasana D, where you put one foot inside of like a half lotus position, and then you twist and you try to bind around the other leg. Like this is a ton of pressure on the knee, a ton of pressure on the shoulders. And a lot of people injure themselves trying to force them into this position that is going to do absolutely nothing for them. So this is why it's like, I don't really try to push myself too far. Like I like to have 100% range of motion in to move and be able to go there, but I'm not going to go past that.
And I think like what you're saying, and like it's I think it is quite important to understand, what it is out of the movement, posture, the exercise that you're actually going to get the benefits from, as opposed to the actual accomplishment of that particular exercise. And I think that's a good way to kind of work on maybe also disassociating like I think people obviously like they want to be very goal oriented. So they're like, I have to get this posture, or I have to get this movement. And they'll almost do it to the detriment of their long-term health. And they'll just push themselves to like some max capacity and not actually think about what are all the basic components that I need or should work on to actually get those goals that I want. So when we think about like flexibility, because it can be such a long-term goal to achieve like a middle split or a front split for some people, some movements and postures that you do, sometimes they take a really long time, and motivation can obviously be an issue. So Angela here asked about like the idea of like doing arm balances or handstand or any of that kind of flexibility stuff. Obviously there's a lot of things to choose from. So how do you go about that process of like narrowing down a focus while also maintaining a high level of motivation through your practice?
Consistency, building a habit, doing what you want to do, and being being really diligent to always do it. It's easy to get complacent in our practice. It's easy to be like, oh, I just need a rest day, this, or like right now I'm getting tattooed, and that's something that takes me out of my practice. And so I notice if I have a few days without practicing, or a few days without my normal routine, that it's harder for me to get back into it. If I don't take those days off, if I just am really disciplined about it, then it's a lot easier. That's the main thing. Set up your goals. Like what is it that you really want to work on? If it's handstands or back bends or arm balances, whatever. If that's a serious goal for you, then make that a daily practice. I give myself one day off on Sundays is usually my rest day. But other than that, it's like I work through the things that I want, and I might vary through some stuff, but because I approach things more in a from like a yoga like consistency thing, I'm doing a lot more of the same things as far as skill-based stuff. When it comes to stressing the body in different areas, you don't want to overstress it. You want to vary between different areas, different lines of tension and strength. Yeah, that's the hardest thing to do, is to establish a habit. Just do it. And if you don't have a lot of time, it gets even harder. I'm pretty lucky that I have quite a few hours every morning to be able to wake up and do my meditation and my breathing practice, and then get into my physical practice. So
yeah, and I think something else to keep in mind as well when you think about, and this goes back to what Dylan was saying about like having a daily practice that with regards to like flexibility, like being able to hit all the muscle groups, hit all the stretching that we need to do on a daily basis, even if it's for a very short time. Because one of the things that can be very difficult for consistency's sake is if you spend one day and you just like destroy yourself, and then it's, if you feel really bad the next day, like you're super, super sore, it's also going to be a little bit difficult to kind of get back into continued training, right?
yeah,
With weight training a lot, right? Someone who doesn't train very much, they go in the first time, they want to go super intense, and then they're like borderline immobilized because they're so sore and they don't train for like a week. It happens a lot for sure in weight training.
yeah. One thing to think about that is that the degradation to synthesis or breakdown to growth, the more that you break down, the more recovery time that you're going to have. And that doesn't necessarily equate to the more growth that you're going to have, especially if it's taking you out of your practice. So do less, do more, but less of more. So you're being a little bit more rounded. And this is, I think, really changing in the outlook and the philosophy of how most practices, most different disciplines are approaching. I think even in strength training, you see a lot more circuit training kind of stuff, a lot more this global training rather than just like, I think I haven't done bodybuilding in such a long time. I used to like 15 years ago, but when you're, unless that's like really your goal is to put on, I don't know, how much do you, how often do you do chest?
So, obviously whatever your primary focus is on, you'd probably do it a bit more than the other body groups, so maybe you might do it like 2, maybe maximally 3 times a week. But the way it is broken up in like bodybuilding and stuff, when they think of it, is like, okay, they're going to train their chest one day, and then they're going to train the back another day, and then so they're training different body parts. So even though like they're not resting any one particular day, that body part is getting a significant amount of rest before they train that body part again. And that's kind of a general idea of like what a lot of the programs kind of tend to be, is that you might train only each body part maybe once or twice a week. But it's actually planned in the program that's how you're doing it.
Right. Yeah, that's the same approach I had when I didn't know if there's some new stuff with bodybuilding, but the approach that I do now is a little bit kind of the opposite, more like circuit training or something where you're doing a little bit of everything almost every day and building that way. You're not going to see the results that you would as a bodybuilder. You're not going to get big muscles. You'll still be fit. You'll still like I have fairly good muscle tone, and I'm pretty fit, and the way that I move.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit more rounded, different goals and stuff, because most of my movements are more holistic. So I'm always using like every part of my body through that. So it's, I think like with any form of training, it's really be clear about the goals that you have for it, why you want those goals, what you're moving towards, and then finding the right way to do it. And also to do that approach where you're not going to get hurt, right? Because that's going to take you out of it. And just be consistent. Setting up a daily habit is the most important thing, and not compromising. It's too easy to compromise, and these days to give excuses. It's better to give reasons to than excuses not to.
Yeah, and I think and you think about longevity's sake as well, right? It's sometimes the body has an amazing ability to adapt, and sometimes the things that we do to kind of to damage the body doesn't necessarily show up the day after, or 24 hours after doing it. But if it's done to extremes over a longer period of time, at some point, like, you don't want to make 2 years of progress and then have like a major injury basically set you back that 2 years plus even more. So I think that's definitely something to think about with regards to, again, everything we talked about. So is there anything, so we're coming up close to the end here. Is there anything else you want to add in with regards to general tips, cues, principles that you kind of follow through your own training journey?
I think we covered most of it. It's yeah, I think we covered quite a bit, enough for them.
Yeah. And I think for people listening in, like, it's not, I think sometimes people can get too fixated on like the exact words that are actually being said, but something to think about with, what all the things that Dylan mentioned is, what are the ideas and what is he actually talking about? And then how do you actually apply that kind of stuff to your practice? That's kind of where I think the greater value is, right? So instead of worrying about how to train your biceps better, like with what exercise, like what is the actual like intention and mindset that you're kind of going into that practice? Cool. Well, well, Dylan, good luck with all their tattoos coming up. And I'll see you probably here in the next week or so. For everybody tuning in, thank you for your questions and the ones that you've emailed in, and also the ones you've asked here on the session. I hope that you're able to take a lot of this knowledge and wisdom and expand on it, incorporate a lot of it into your own practice. Maybe get in touch with Dylan at some point. What would be the best way to kind of follow along with your journey and with what you're doing?
My website, I keep it updated, dylanwerneryoga.com, or Instagram, Dylan Werner Yoga on Instagram. Those are probably the two best places. I also teach on an app called Allo Moves. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for online training stuff, I do a ton of stuff there. So allomoves.com, just look for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you'll definitely experience from like Dylan's like training sessions is how, like, if you think you actually train hard, like try one of Dylan's like training sessions and you'll really experience what it means to like train hard. But super smart individual. Dylan, I always love talking with you, and look forward to further conversations in the future. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining in. I hope you can take part in the summit as well. There's a lot of other really good sessions with other speakers that are really beneficial. And yeah, see you next time. Stay strong and keep training hard.
Thanks.
Thanks.